Welcome, everyone, to Connecticut Mirror's 2026 Legislative Session Preview with Capitol Bureau Chief Mark Pazniokas. I'm John Dankosky. We're in the studios of Connecticut Public. Thank you so much to the Connecticut Public team for hosting this event tonight. Thank you to Jennifer Evans and the West Hartford Community Interactive team for helping us live stream this event. Before we sit down and talk to Mark here, I want to thank the generous financial supporters of the Mirrors event series. Our presenting sponsor, Eversource, amplifying sponsors, CBIA and Mohegan Tribe, publishing sponsor, CLA, Express Strategies, Hinckley Allen, Rowthorne Law, LLC, and the Causeway Agency. I also want to say that the Connecticut Mirror has a brand new weekly politics newsletter. This is usually the time of these programs that I ask you to donate, and I will do that later. But I want to talk about the new newsletter because it's called The Issue, and it has information about the legislative session and the election season. If you want to be in the know this election year, then you should subscribe to the Mirror's new weekly politics newsletter called The Issue. You can do that at ctmirror.org. Mark Pazniokas, good to see you once again. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, my friend.
And happy new legislative session. Can we just get to maybe just some broad strokes for folks who don't follow this as closely, obviously, as you do? It's a short session. It's an election year. How is it different this year? Like, how are these years different for you and for the legislature?
So for one thing, yes, things are collapsed into each other. What I mean by that, in a longer session year, the governor opens the session with his State of the State address, and then a few weeks later, he comes out with his budget proposal and his budget address. This year, next Wednesday, the governor will deliver his State of the State, and the same day will deliver revisions to the second year of the biennial budget. Connecticut does two-year budgeting, which gives a governor more influence over budgeting. If the governor does not want to deal with any push by the legislature in the second year, he has a budget that is balanced, and in fact, it's projected to produce this fiscal year, which ends in June, at the end of June, it's still projected to produce a $95 million surplus, which is $200 million less than was originally projected because of Medicaid expenses and some other things. But it's, the Connecticut budget still is in decent shape for the time being.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about what they're going to do with any surplus money they have or any contingency funds that they've dealt with earlier. And of course, we do have a budget session preview coming up with Keith Faniff in just a little bit that we'll be talking about. But we'll talk about what the governor is expected to talk about in his message that happens next Wednesday.
So, because it is an election year, the governor, his speech will hopefully, in his view, frame the session, the issues that he hopes will be taken up, issues he hopes will not be taken up, and also frame a message for the summer and fall, in his case the fall, because with all due respect to Representative Josh Elliott, it does not appear that Governor Lamont will face a primary. But it is a political speech as well as a policy speech. The governor has sat down in the last week with the leaders of the Democratic majority leaders of the House and Senate to see if they can have a common agenda. That even though Connecticut is a trifecta state, that means all three branches, the House, the Senate, and the governor are all controlled by Democrats, but they are hardly monolithic, and there's plenty of tension within the caucuses in both chambers, as well as tension with the governor. We, as this audience no doubt knows, the governor is more of a fiscal, depending what scale you want to use, fiscal conservative, moderate, centrist, what have you. And there's that tension about how Connecticut should meet its needs and still abide by some fairly strict spending caps. You know, we have 3 caps. We have a spending cap, we have a revenue cap, and we have a volatility cap. And money is always an issue in every session, and it's an issue you either don't have enough of it, and that raises one set of problems, or you have plenty, and that raises another set of problems. What do you do with it? And in this case, with these spending caps, and particularly a volatility cap, you can't spend a lot of it. It never goes into the budget. It gets set aside into a budget reserve fund, and once that is full, and it is, the money then flows to pay down a pension debt. So again, money, no matter in good times or bad times, money is always something that tends to define a new session of the General Assembly.
Well, let's talk a little bit about money. And when we last were in this room and we were talking with the Democratic and the Republican leaders of the House of Representatives, there was some conversation about, what do we do with the contingency fund that was sort of essentially put aside by the governor and the legislature to deal with some of the issues that are coming down from the federal government. Not all of that money has been spent. There's still some money to be spent. On the one hand, the folks in the Democratic caucus who've been asking Governor Lamont to do something with our surpluses and with our money and to actually help the people of Connecticut who maybe have been asking for additional spending. Some of that has been done, but that's going to be one of the, battles during this legislative session. What do we do with the rest, and how do we make sure that Connecticut gets what it's supposed to get to its citizens if the federal government can't?
So in special session last fall, they did create this $500 million contingency fund. There is about $332 million left. And under the terms of the statute that was passed last year, Governor Lamont has really unilateral authority over how to spend that $500 million. And he has spent money to help the people whose health insurance costs were spiking, the people who get their health coverage through the Affordable Care Act. Those folks were greatly benefiting from tax credits that were expiring, tax credits that subsidize their premiums. So the governor put money on the table for that, and that is subsidizing. It doesn't fully make up the lost federal credits, but it helped to a certain degree. They put money out to make up the loss of funding when the government shut down, and SNAP. That may happen again. Once the legislature comes in on February 4th, what is left in that $500 million fund now is subject to the control of the General Assembly. It goes through the appropriation process. At this point, there seems to be a bipartisan vibe if indeed there are similar cuts or suspensions of federal grants that we saw last fall and into December. It seems to be a sense that the legislature will move quickly to fill those gaps.
What are some other ways that you see that the governor's priorities and the priorities of Democrats in the legislature may diverge?
Well, the fundamental one has been whether or not these spending caps should be loosened. And, you have a Senate Democratic majority that is going to oversimplify, but the Senate Democratic majority is the most liberal kind of faction at the Capitol. The House of Representatives under the Speaker, Matt Ritter, is very much a social liberal, but he has a very diverse caucus as far as coming from all different kinds of districts, and he is very aware of that. He has been somewhat in between, where the governor has been really trying to preserve the caps as were drafted and revised in 2018 when Republicans held half the seats in the Senate. They were 4 or 5 short of a majority in the House, and they came up with a bipartisan budget in 2017 that included this new idea of the volatility cap, which very briefly is they looked at the sources of revenue that historically had been very volatile, and it's the stuff that people file quarterly, either their income taxes or business taxes, and they looked at the most recent number as to what they viewed as the threshold for volatile income, and anything above what it produced that year would be set aside as too volatile to rely on. Now, that has been good in many ways for Connecticut, which has a horrible record of fiscal management regarding its pensions. Connecticut, from 1939 up until 2010, when Dan Malloy took office, or at the end of 2010, or I'm sorry, the beginning of 2011, but they did not pay into their pensions. They did a lot of it was pay as you go. They did not invest enough money. They did not have that money grow through investments on Wall Street. But one of the issues with the volatility cap, in almost every year since then, it is produced in excess of $1 billion. As one year it was only $500 million. So the argument is, how volatile is it if it is reliably producing this $1 billion that kind of comes off the top? When I talk about the surplus, this money comes out before even that surplus number. So the good news for Connecticut is, if we get a recession, there is the budget reserve. There's a statutory maximum. You can set aside up to 18% of the general fund, and it's been full for a couple of years. There's $4 billion plus set aside. But whether you talk to conservative lawmakers, liberal lawmakers, there is a consensus that Connecticut definitely has unmet needs, whether it be reimbursements for the nonprofit providers who are really an extension of state government, who do vital things like group homes for people with disabilities. Connecticut's Medicaid reimbursement rates have really not been brought up to standards, and that can be a problem if you're on Medicaid getting certain health care.
But on top of those things, as you said, there's the possibility of another federal government shutdown, right? And so is that something that has to be really negotiated between lawmakers and the governor? Like, how do we think about putting aside maybe even more dollars for what could happen in the future?
To set aside more money would require, all right, we've got a little, we have to do the quickie version of how some of these caps work. The simplest explanation is,
we should have a little theme music for this. Because it sounds like it's something like Schoolhouse Rock or something. But please go ahead.
Well,
explain.
Every time I talk about one of these caps, I have no interest whatsoever when I'm reading sports pages about the sports writers who are experts on the NFL spending cap and all this stuff. It's like, just tell me who's playing. But so in the case of these spending caps, a governor can declare an emergency, and that has happened a half dozen times. It was particularly common when we had Republican governors and Democratic majorities in the legislature. So a Republican governor would declare an emergency, and it required a 60% vote of the General Assembly to get out from under these caps. So the beauty of that politically, when there was a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, both parties owned it. You really couldn't use that in a political sense of saying, those guys, they blew up the cap to spend money. But they're going to have to do that this year if they want to add more to this contingency fund. But again, the early indications are, since the legislature will be in session, you don't have the argument last year when in special session they gave the governor this extraordinary authority to unilaterally spend parts of, as much as he saw fit of this $500 million contingency. There was some oversight. The 6 top legislative leaders, if they wanted to object to it, they could. But as a practical matter, Ned Lamont had complete control over $500 million, and he will continue to do so until the legislature convenes on February 4th.
I want to get into some more specifically legislative questions, but before we turn away completely from Governor Lamont for a second, because this is an election season, how do you think he frames himself in this session in terms of, and even just with his speech next week, telling a story of the things that he's done for the people of Connecticut? I mean, what do you expect to hear from him in terms of, here's my resume, and here's why you need to elect me one more time?
So here's the trick for Ned Lamont. He is seeking a third term, so he obviously has a record. If you set aside his first disastrous year in office when he reneged on a campaign promise and he pitched a return to highway tolls for all motor vehicles instead of just...
Remember the highway tolls thing? That was fun.
And
he loves talking about that still. But
not only did he renege on a campaign promise, but it was ineptly rolled out. They had no plan to convince you people, all right, you're going to pay tolls, but this is what you're going to get. This is the time you're going to save. 6 months after he rolled that out, they actually had a plan, but, that ship had sailed. You may recall something called COVID in 2020, and Ned Lamont had a second opportunity to make an impression on people of Connecticut. And, based on polling, based on public reaction in general, I think most people gave Ned Lamont good marks for being a steady and reassuring voice that perhaps offered a little contrast to the president at that point, and it was the last year of the Trump administration. You may recall that on one weekend, the president, seemingly off the cuff, broached the idea of having a quarantine of the tri-state area, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. And, the governor, national media offered his very measured reaction in contrast to the president. And Ned Lamont benefited very much from that contrast, and perhaps he will again, because it's even more so this time.
This is always important in an election year. What's his relationship with labor right now? And to that end, how does that make its way into this legislative session, if at all?
So he's had few vetoes, but one of them was a priority bill of labor. It's a bill that would have provided unemployment compensation to strikers who are out longer than 2 weeks. And it was something that was strongly supported by the Senate Democratic Caucus. The House Democratic Caucus initially would not take it up, but when it came up a second time, the Speaker, Matt Ritter, said, I'm going to, I'll call it to a vote. It passed. The governor vetoed it. Now, the governor does have a record with labor that is positive. He signed increase to the minimum wage that raised it to $15 and then indexed it. So Connecticut's minimum wage is now one of the highest in the United States, and it goes up on autopilot pegged to a consumer price index. He also made good on a promise to sign Family and Medical Leave Act, expansion of paid sick days law. So he does have a labor record. Ed Hawthorne, the president of the AFL-CIO, who was very bitter over the veto of the strikers bill, said, yeah, first term Ned was great, second term not much. And that's been the dynamic with labor. Will they bring up the strikers bill again unclear. There are other labor issues. There was the beginnings of a deal last year that the Teamsters Union and the governor's office agreed on what really became commonly known as kind of an Amazon warehouse bill. The idea of having clearer and more stringent standards about working conditions in warehouses. It was written in a more broader way, but it really was geared to Amazon and the complaints that have come out of Amazon fulfillment centers about the metrics these workers have to meet.
Does that come back? I mean, is that something that's going to be discussed again?
That could pass if they bring it up. The version that the governor favored was perhaps not as far-reaching as some other proponents wanted. So that's always a question: do you accept an incremental change, or do you swing for the home run? And that's always a question at the General Assembly. Incremental advances versus holding out and doing something more dramatic.
We got a bunch of questions from folks in advance, and Richard is asking about something that I think is on a lot of people's minds, so let's talk about this for a bit. He asks, how can the Connecticut legislature pass laws that can mitigate ICE, ban law enforcement from wearing masks, forbid ICE from attacking peaceful protests? Those are some ideas that Richard has. How do you think that the legislature and the governor are going to address what's happening in Minnesota right now, for instance?
So there are two things with that. You have an emotional response, you have a desire to respond. And then the question is, what can you do as public policy that would make a substantive difference? So this stuff gets very tricky. So Connecticut has the Trust Act. The original version passed bipartisan basis. The original Trust Act, basically the point of it was, we want people, regardless of their immigration status, to feel comfortable calling the police if they're a victim of a crime, calling the police if they are a witness to a crime, being willing to show up in a court of law and testify if they witnessed something or if they were victimized by something. That was the basics of the Trust Act. And everybody said, fine. It didn't mean that the state couldn't or wouldn't notify ICE that they had somebody in state custody if they were accused of certain crimes, violent crimes. I mean, that in a nutshell was it. And with the Trump administration, Trump 1 and Trump 2, the Trust Act was revised a couple times to be more specific and more limiting as to the degree to which law enforcement and state courts could cooperate with ICE. The basic constitutional basis for that is no state, no municipality can be compelled by the federal government under our Constitution to enforce federal law. But there's a balancing thing there, but that's become very, very partisan. The last revision to the Trust Act was to codify something that the Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, who also acts as basically the chief administrator of the court system, who ordered that ICE would not be allowed in courthouses to pursue people that they had a detainer order on.
Yeah.
But it hasn't, there was an incident recently where somebody being pursued by ICE ran into a courthouse and was tackled by a judicial marshal. So one of the questions that I'm hearing at the General Assembly now is there's a desire to know from the court system, what is the training for the judicial marshals when they interact with ICE? I mean, nobody wants a conflict between an armed judicial marshal and an armed federal agent over what they can and cannot do. There is a desire to avoid that kind of thing. But the other law that's in place here, in play here, is the police accountability law that was passed a few years ago. Now that that does not directly apply to federal law enforcement. There's qualified immunity, there's a federal preemption, but here's the question. That law did a couple of things. One of them is it created a duty to intervene on the part of any law enforcement officers, municipal, state, who are clearly covered by the law, to intervene if they witness abuse by another law enforcement officer. Now when that was written, the assumption is, if you have an incident in Hartford, you have a Hartford cop who you want to feel empowered and required to intervene if he sees a fellow officer doing something abusive. When that law passed, nobody anticipated where we are now, what you're seeing in Minneapolis. If you are a local cop and you are witnessing a federal agent doing something, does the duty to intervene apply? And if so, how do you do that when you have a federal force that is not working cooperatively? It's not like, the federal task. I covered federal courts for a long time. There'll be all kinds of federal local task force, and they were all on the same team. This is a completely different matter. And the question is, at the General Assembly, there's a desire to do something and really make sure that local cops are willing to step up. But the tricky part is, how do you do that without having an armed conflict between local and federal law enforcement?
Well, and the things that you just outlined talked about, some of the ways in which Connecticut may have addressed this with the Trust Act, or may have addressed this in the past with police accountability. But that has to do with law enforcement. But there's so many other layers to what we're seeing happening, not just in Minneapolis, but in places across the country, right? You have the ability for people to peacefully gather and protest, and how are they protected by local law enforcement? You have people showing up at schools and outside of places where people are trying to get medical help, right? So beyond just the idea that you might want to protect people from, not being able to testify, not being able to go to a police station for fear of being arrested by ICE. But then you also have people who feel like they can't send their kids to school. They have people who feel like they can't go get medical care. Are those things that the legislature may have the stomach to take on this time?
They have, to a degree, regarding trying to protect schools and make them safe havens, the way they tried to protect courts. But the problem is, ICE can stand on the border of schools if they're looking for somebody. And we've had incidents in Connecticut of teenagers who have been detained. There was a case in Meriden. And again, that's why I said you have the desire to do something substantively at the General Assembly, but you also have this almost emotional need where quite frankly, there's anger. It's one of the issues with legislators is, legislators want to legislate. So every time you see a problem that makes them passionate about something, the instinct, understandably, is to look for a legislative solution, because that's where they are and that's what they do. The issue with ICE is obviously transcended that kind of thing, and it's put the governor in an awkward position at times. Josh Elliott, the state rep who is trying to challenge the governor for the nomination, has been critical. But Lamont actually has spoken out fairly clearly at times, but again, he's Ned Lamont. He is not a rhetorical bomb thrower. One of his comments where I believe he used the word ICE terrorizing people, and Vinnie Catalora, the House Republican leader, accused the governor of inflammatory language, and I think most people would not view Ned Lamont as being guilty of being inflammatory at any time whatsoever, because he is. People at this point, people know who he is. He is a pretty steady individual who perhaps is not as outspoken at times as some people would like, but at other times Some other people are undoubtedly grateful that at this time there is a bit of a steadier voice, perhaps.
When Vinnie Candelora was here last time we had one of these conversations, you were covering that, and we talked a bit before and afterward. And one of the things he said when asked about whether or not the Connecticut legislature should think about how ICE may or may not intervene in Connecticut, he essentially said the problem with ICE is the people who protest ICE. Now, that was before Minneapolis, but that was after incidents elsewhere. I guess I'm wondering if you were surprised by that coming from the Republican legislative leader.
No, because I've had conversation with him and other members of the General Assembly. And I think where that came from is a view, rightly or wrongly, but a view that these protests have taken an additional step, that it's a resistance. And people in this room may or may not think that is great. But it's a little bit different than picketing outside something. I think what Candelora was talking about is that there are efforts to intervene, to obstruct. And I think many of the people doing that would quickly say, you're damn right. You know, these organized efforts in neighborhoods, when ICE is in the neighborhood, you know, there are horns that are honking, there are whistling, there are phone trees. There's all kinds of stuff to protect people who their neighbors say should be protected. That yes, they are here without documentation. Yes, they are here illegally to agree, but they, in many cases, they have been here for years and years and years. And President Trump has done many things as he promised to do, but in this instance, the great tension is he said, I'm going to go after the worst of the worst, the violent. And in some cases, yes, but there's certainly other cases, no. I mean, I had a roof replaced this year, and I talked to, you know, the guy who owns, or the foreman, and I said, has ICE come to your job sites? And he said, oh yeah, because they were all of, you know, Latino background. And he said, yeah, I mean, they had my guys come down off the roof and show their papers. And this guy, I don't know what his politics were, but it was interesting. You could see he was clearly annoyed, the idea that they had to show their papers. Over what grounds? That they were Hispanic, they were in a business where there have been a history of illegal people, you know. But all his people checked out, and it was not a problem. But he, as he said to me, he said, trust me, he said, nobody from MS-13 is doing roofing in Connecticut in August or working at a car wash in Newington. And that was another thing. So, you know, the administration clearly has lost some of the support for what it promised, which is controlling the borders. And every poll I've seen saying there's great support for controlling the borders in a way that the Biden administration had kind of lost control. But again, how this is unfolded and the criticism that you have from police chiefs and sheriffs about the intimidation tactics, you know, particularly in Minneapolis, you know, so that is the battle, and I don't know if there is a legislative solution for any of that, as opposed to a desire to speak clearly that this is unacceptable to a large swath of Americans.
But it sounds from what you're saying like there will probably be some legislative attempts made over the course of this.
Legislators got to legislate.
Yeah, that's what they do. Let's move on to some other topics. Tom from Hamden asks about a couple things. Can you tell us about any upcoming bills that would address climate and also democracy and voting rights?
I'll start with the easy one, which is the voting rights. So there will be legislation, certainly the House intends to. As you may recall, we had a constitutional amendment that was passed a couple years ago, which allows the General Assembly to determine the rules of the road for absentee voting by statute, as opposed to some pretty strict limits that were in our Constitution. So the House Speaker says they're definitely going to do that this year. But a lot of the controversy and energy has fallen out of that with the passage of early voting. So the no excuse or universal absentee balloting doesn't have the same punch that it did prior to early voting. But they're going to do that. And every time you do a voting bill, it is a vehicle for people to talk about all kinds of related issues. So certain Republicans have always insisted that Connecticut should have a photo ID requirement to vote. So you will most likely have that debate again. But as far as broader voting rights, I don't know if we'll go much beyond that. And then climate.
Well, but before you get to climate very quickly, in conversations I've had with the Secretary of the State, I mean, I think people can basically say, yes, it's been a success that we have early voting in Connecticut. However, the first couple go-arounds, people probably don't know as much about this as they probably should, and probably people could be better informed. And something she's talked about is, wouldn't it be great if the legislature could actually help people understand a little bit better how to do this? Is there any money to be spent to get people understanding how this now slightly more complex voting system works?
No, that's been a failure of early voting. There are a couple of towns, Hamden may have been one, where they put money on the table and they did have higher participation. One of the things about early voting, and again, the data set, the experience is not great enough to really draw conclusions, but the hope was it would increase overall voter turnout, not simply make it more convenient for people who are going to vote anyway. Yeah. And so, the jury's out on that. There are some other things that are part of early voting. There aren't the sexiest things, but are 14 days too much? Secretary of State Thomas recommended 10 days, which would have 2 weekends. And in some of these smaller towns, another 4 days, it's significant staffing. Do you really need it? And again, it's not, it's not make or break stuff, but that's something that they probably will look at. Can you cut it back to perhaps 10 days, as Stephanie Thomas recommended, and live with that for a while? There are some procedural things. If any of you have voted voted in early voting, you got to put it in the envelope. You got to make sure your signature is in the right place. There was a polling place was it Stonington or Stonington, and they kind of screwed up. And the question was, what would you do with all these votes? So, you don't want that kind of screw up to invalidate, dozens or hundreds of ballots. And so there is, I think there is a desire to look at the mechanics of it and make sure that there's no danger of that happening.
They've got a lot of places to look for how to do the mechanics, because almost every other state, other than Connecticut, has been doing this for quite some time. So it's not as though they can't do their homework. Moving on to climate, what do we expect to see? Because there's always, amongst people for whom climate change, the environment, is a primary concern, and it's sort of an existential threat to the planet. I think that they're consistently disappointed with the legislative efforts to address it. I'm wondering if that is going to be the case again this year.
The political atmosphere around that issue has changed dramatically since the House of Representatives passed a climate bill a couple of years ago that was not taken up in the Senate. It was at the end of the session, and it was a bill that had more carrots than sticks. It was not really something that was onerous for business. But it was a pivotal year when it came to like electric vehicles a few years ago, back when the assumption was Connecticut would continue to follow the California standards as it had for years and years and years. And it came to, this was about California's timetable for encouraging the transition to electric vehicles. By the way, the EPA timetable at that point, when you view it in today's political atmosphere, that was a pretty aggressive timetable itself. But, you know, that was a major stumble in Connecticut. It started with Republican opposition to Connecticut implementing those revised or upgraded California air standards, and it failed. There are regulations that would have implemented it. Connecticut is a little unusual in that regulations are adopted by a committee that is bipartisan. It doesn't matter how lopsided the majorities are overall. This is a 50-50 deal. So you had Republicans opposed to those California standards. And then you also had the Black and Puerto Rican caucus saying, hey, wait a minute. I don't know how this is going to work in a dense urban area. And, you know, so it became a broader issue, and those regulations failed. So that's a long-winded way of saying I really don't know how ambitious you're going to see anybody on climate this year. Energy costs, they have jumped ahead of climate, I think, in the General Assembly. Connecticut, as well as really the rest of New England, has some of the most expensive power, and that has been a huge issue, and it's going to be an issue in an election year.
Is an issue like that in this current political climate, is that coupled with like an overarching idea of affordability, what it costs to live in a place like Connecticut or a country like the United States? Because that's obviously, if you look at national approval ratings for politicians, I mean, this idea of affordability is a huge issue on people's minds. Are electric rates here in Connecticut, in your mind, coupled with the overall affordability thing, or is that a separate, like a sort of a separate issue in terms of the way legislators look at it?
Well, I mean, it's separate to the degree that we have it's called a deregulated energy system, but that's not quite right. It's partly deregulated, and the rest of it is kind of hard to figure out at times. So what I mean is, so Connecticut in the late 80s deregulated the generation of power. You know, in the old days, Eversource, or then was Northeast Utilities, United Illuminating, they owned power plants. And the state regulators would look at those rates, what it cost, and, you know, they would, into their rates would be reasonable compensation for what it cost. Now you have, you know, and people can now see it in their electric bills. The electric bills, there are 4 different segments, but it will have the generation, which Eversource can't control, and PURA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, can't control. That's set by a market. So there's a limit to what you can do. There is something in Connecticut that was, you know, only the real hardcore policy wonks even knew what it was, but something called the public benefits charge. But now that's in your bill. It's broken out. And there has been a push to say, well, anything that's in there, we ought to just take it out. And, you know, it has things like money to invest in electrification, you know, for EV chargers, and but it also has things like covering programs that help people who can't afford to pay their light bill. That's in there. There's also some technical things. It's ISO, which handles the larger transmission systems that Connecticut relies on, that is in there. You can't make that go away. But we'll probably see that debate again. What the legislature did previously is they borrowed money, they bonded money to subsidize some of the public benefit charge, which I don't know if that's the smartest way to go. Because the question is, where should some of these programs, if you're talking about programs that are meant to increase efficiency to help people insulate their homes, should that be paid by all ratepayers, or should, if that's a good public purpose, should that go to the larger state budget?
Before I ask a follow-up question on energy, specifically heating, did anybody in the room here notice that the heat just came on? There's actually a little bit of warm air. I was slightly worried that the people watching on television could see my breath. It was really, really cold in here, Paz, just a moment ago. So to that end, what happens though with Pura this year? Just sort of the structure of this organization. I mean, probably if you counted up the number of words written about any one thing in the Connecticut Mirror last year, it may have been about Pura. And so I guess I'm wondering how that gets tackled, if at all, in this legislative session.
So Governor Lamont put himself in the middle of a protracted controversy over the governance of Pura. I'm not going to revisit all of that, but the brief. Please don't. But the governor's choice to be the chair of Pura was a woman named Marissa Gillette. She came from outside government. She had a background in utilities law. She came in, and it was then a 3-member authority. The other 2 members were former lawmakers. Historically, Pura, or its predecessor, was a great place for former lawmakers to end up. You spike your pension, you get a decent salary.
Such a deal.
And the 2 lawmakers who were on there, they had a certain expertise developed over the years. But Connecticut was unusual in that most states you see turnover between 5 years, 8 years. One of the members was on for more than 25 years, as I recall, and then the other one for more than a decade. But in any event, the governor hemmed and hawed over, there was a statutory authority. It was really not discretionary. You were supposed to have 5 members. The governor never filled them. He finally agreed to fill all 5 spots. Marissa Gillette was removed. She resigned under some pressure. There was a question about whether or not she was biased. There was this almost soap opera about her. Did she ghostwrite an opinion piece that 2 lawmakers published in the Connecticut Mirror? The utilities were really out to remove her because she was very, very aggressive in looking at their expenses. Most people, I think, many people applauded that. The downside was there was a lot of unrest at Pura. There was a lot of staff turnover. Anyway, she's gone. There are now, it's a 5-member authority. 4 of the 5 are new enough that they have never gone through the full confirmation process. So that's going to happen this session. So the question is, will those confirmation hearings become a venue for broader debate or broader questions about what happened with the previous mess, or where the authority should go looking forward?
I want to ask about, and a couple of people have asked us about public health questions. During this legislative session, does Connecticut do anything to specifically say, like, look, federal guidance for vaccines, for childhood vaccines, for COVID vaccines, for whatever, has changed dramatically. It's diverged quite a bit from most scientific consensus. Does Connecticut address this in any way and say, look, we need to have our own standards here?
Yes, so a couple things are happening with that. Connecticut is one of 10 states that have formed this consortium to sort of have their own kind of rump version of CDC to look at best practices. That's one thing. When it comes to the vaccines and the new guidelines that CDC has put out under Bobby Kennedy Jr., Connecticut is quite clearly going to decouple from the federal standards. The governor later this week, I expect he is going to come out and articulate what that means precisely. Will that require legislation? Will that require regulations? The Commissioner of Public Health has a great deal of authority in Connecticut in that regard. So the question is, can it be handled through regulations? But the schedule the CDC put out, there used to be like 17 required vaccines. They're down to 11. Connecticut intent under the Lamont administration is to continue to require all 17.
It's somewhat connected to this, but I'm wondering if anything comes up this legislative session having to do with oversight over homeschooling.
So I laugh because homeschooling is a topic at the General Assembly that terrifies a lot of people, because the homeschoolers are very well organized. They will turn out in huge numbers whenever there's an effort to change what are the very scant rules of the road for homeschoolers. But a couple of things happen, and the question is this a DCF issue or a homeschooler issue? There were two awful cases that came to light that this audience and the live streaming audience undoubtedly are aware of. There was the incident in Waterbury where a 32-year-old man escaped, and it turned out he had been held captive for 20 years by a stepmother. And he disappeared from the system because they said, we're going to homeschool him. And this was a family that had some DCF involvement, and DCF did not follow up. So the question is, does that speak to the lack of oversight on homeschooling, or is it something specific, points to a problem with DCF? A second case in New Britain, there was the body of an 11-year-old child found in a plastic case. And this was a family that also was on the radar of DCF. And the family said, the child is being homeschooled. That's why she disappeared from school. And she's being homeschooled out of state, which is kind of a weird thing. And DCF, they wanted to see the child, and there was a Zoom call. And it turned out later that they found another child to act as the child who had died, who they later determined was the victim of abuse and malnutrition. So again, is that a homeschooling issue, or is that a DCF issue, or a little bit of both?
But and of course, what's interesting is legislators may be terrified of a lobby of people who show up at the state capitol who homeschool their kids. But if I was part of that group of parents, and I thought for a second that a lawmaker was going to base rules having to do with how I homeschool my kids on horrible acts that seem to have only very tangential connection to homeschooling and really are about something much deeper and more horrifying, I would probably be picketing too, right? It feels like it feels like not exactly the right way to solve for that problem.
Homeschooling in Connecticut is very lightly regulated compared to other states. I mean, that's just a fact. And the homeschooling parents would like to, by and large, would like to keep it that way. This also is somewhat connected to controversies over your belief in the efficacy and safety of vaccines. So Connecticut, a few years ago, repealed the religious exemption to the requirement that you have your children vaccinated for them to enter school, public school, and actually, parochial schools. And the religious exemption, it was, you just claimed it. You did not have to be a member of a church. In fact, very few organized religions discourage people from vaccinations, including Christian Scientists. It's an interesting thing. But so it became just sort of a personal philosophy thing, and Connecticut repealed that. And some of the folks who felt put off by that began homeschooling their children. So you also have that element as well. And again, there are many homeschool children whose parents are organized and do all kinds of enrichment. And so, I don't mean to in any way, shape, or form demonize, homeschoolers, but there is this issue about the real lack of standards. And again, the question of what was the role of the lack of oversight for homeschoolers, and how did that contribute to what appears to be negligence by DCF in these two horrific cases?
We're almost up against time. We covered a bunch of stuff, but there's so much more to cover. What number legislative session is this for you, Mark?
I don't know. I have been periodically let out for good behavior, so I have not. I have been a reporter for 46 years, and not all of it covering the General Assembly, but probably 30 of the 40 years have been covering the General Assembly. Politics has been a theme of my career. I had 8 glorious years covering federal courts, which is a great joy because it's a small system. You get to know the judges. The issues are interesting, and they have resources. It's not like covering Superior Court where there's high volume and stuff. But in any event, so it's been a long time.
Okay, so you've covered a bunch of these, so you sort of know the ropes. But I know something that you're thinking about too is and something that I think certainly Governor Lamont will be possibly addressing when he gives his speech next week. It's the 200.
My longevity?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right? It's the 250th anniversary of America, right? And something that Governor Lamont and other lawmakers, certainly in Connecticut, talk about is this sort of great American experiment, which, I think for a lot of Americans right now, it feels as though the experiment isn't working that well. I guess I'm wondering how you're thinking about this anniversary, how you think maybe the governor and the people up at the Capitol are thinking about this, because it's a momentous time in America, and it feels a little less momentous than perhaps it should. How are you thinking about it?
The governor, I have reason to believe the governor intends to address this in his speech Wednesday, offering it as a moment of inspiration, perhaps, and reflection, but it comes at an incredibly difficult time. And, Connecticut is, the nation is supposed to be building towards this great celebration on the 4th of July this year, as it did in 1976, when I observed that at Schaefer Stadium in Foxborough, watching Elton John. It was not terribly patriotic, but that's what I did on 4th of July that year. It circles back to the conversation about ICE. And again, it's not truly a legislative issue. It's not a purely Connecticut political issue. But it is something that sort of hangs over these very difficult times that we're in. And the governor is a history buff, not to the same degree that the Senate President Marty Looney is, who has a photographic memory for anything he's ever read, heard, or seen. But the governor does talk about that. And, it'll be interesting to see how he weaves that in next Wednesday to talking about, more perhaps mundane matters about about spending and how it factors into another election season.
Mark Pazniokas, it's always great for you to share your expertise with us. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about the upcoming legislative session, and congratulations on getting to cover another one.
Thank you very much.
I thank you very much, and thanks to our crowd who came out. On this snowy night, I want to thank some folks who helped to make this possible. The folks at Connecticut Public, of course, for hosting us. West Hartford Community Interactive for helping us live stream this event. Our sponsors of our event series, Eversource, CBIA, Mohegan Tribe, publishing sponsor CLA Express Strategies, Hinckley Allen, Rowthorne Law LLC, and the Causeway Agency. Coming up next on this series is our 2026 budget review with Connecticut Mirror State Budget reporter Keith Faniff. It's on Wednesday, February 11th at 6 p.m. We won't be doing it here in this freezing room. We'll be doing it on Zoom from my house. Please visit ctmirror.org/events for registration there. And please do sign up for The Issue, which is our new weekly politics newsletter. While you're there signing up for that, you can also click that red donate button, because news coverage of the legislature has been a big part of the Connecticut Mirror since the start. We started it, as a matter of fact, because this guy became a free agent from his previous job covering the legislature, and we saw what was happening to the press corps that covers every day at the state capitol. That's why the Connecticut Mirror got started. And the Connecticut Mirror is only here because people support it directly. With newspapers going away, with other sources, including public media, in great jeopardy, the idea that there is an independent source to get news about the legislature and the governor and the governor's race, it's really important and vital. So even if it's a couple bucks, make sure that you donate to the Connecticut Mirror. I'll see you for this event with Keith in just a couple weeks. Please drive home safe in the snow, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And I know it wasn't nearly as specific as some of you probably wanted. We could have talked about the CBAC negotiations. I mean, that's going to be